this clown! Can anyone here believe the nerve of this pathetic excuse for an accountant?
The wind on Delancey Street did not care that Daniel Cole had nothing left to give it. It came in sharp and low, cutting through the thin fabric of his $20 suit like it was made of paper, and he pulled the jacket tighter across his chest, feeling the seams strain against his shoulders, feeling the cold settle into his bones the way it had every morning for the past 3 years. His shoes were the worst of it. The left one had a crack along the sole that let in water with every step, a slow seep of icy slush that soaked through his sock and numbed his toes before he had even crossed 2 blocks. And the right one was held together at the heel with a strip of duct tape he had wrapped so many times it had turned grey and brittle in the cold. He walked anyway. He walked because 6-year-old Emma was waiting for him at Mrs. Alvarez's apartment 2 floors below his own, coughing that same dry, rattling cough she had been coughing for 3 weeks now. The one the doctor at the free clinic had looked at with tired eyes and said the word heart and the word murmur and the word surgery like they were small words, like they did not weigh more than the whole world on a man's chest. Daniel had not slept the night before. He had sat at the small folding table in their apartment, the one with a wobbling leg he had fixed with a folded matchbook, and he had pressed his one good shirt with an iron that hissed and spat but somehow still worked, and he had gone over the interview questions in his head until the words blurred together, because Sterling Global Holdings did not hire people like him. Not really. Not people who had been out of the accounting world for 3 years. Not people whose resume had a gap in it shaped exactly like a grave. His wife Rebecca had been gone 3 years now. The accident had taken her on a rainy October night, and it had taken something else from Daniel too, something quieter, something that used to sit behind his ribs and tell him he was worth something. And in the years since, he had learned to live without it, the way a man learns to live with a missing tooth, running his tongue over the gap out of habit, feeling the absence more than he ever felt the presence of anything else. He had been a senior accountant once, at a firm 2 states away, with a corner desk and a company badge, and a wife who packed his lunch in a blue thermos, and now he cleaned floors at a warehouse from midnight to 6 in the morning, and delivered newspapers before dawn, and still could not always make rent. And today he was walking 11 blocks in the cold because the bus fare would have meant no dinner for Emma, and there was no version of Daniel Cole that let his daughter go hungry. The glass tower of Sterling Global Holdings rose up ahead of him, like something from another world, 70 floors of gleaming steel and mirrored windows catching the pale winter sun. And Daniel stood at the base of it for a moment, just breathing, watching his breath curl white in the air, feeling suddenly and completely aware of how small he was, how thin his jacket was, how the cuffs of his shirt had gone soft and grey from washing. He thought of Emma's small hand in his the night before, her fingers cold despite the blanket, and she had looked up at him and said, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" And he had told her yes, because that was the only answer a father could give, even when his own chest was tight with the same fear, even when he did not know if it was true. He pushed through the revolving door and stepped into a lobby that smelled like money, all marble floors and hushed voices, and a fountain trickling somewhere near the elevators. And he felt every eye in the room slide over him and then away, the way people look past a stray dog on the sidewalk. Not cruel, just indifferent, just certain he did not belong. He found the sign for the interview group, 3rd floor, entry-level financial analyst position, and he took the elevator up with 4 other applicants, all of them in suits that fit, suits that had never been bought second-hand from a bin outside a church. And Daniel kept his eyes on the numbers climbing above the door, counting his own heartbeat instead of looking at anyone. The waiting room on the 3rd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows and leather chairs, and Daniel lowered himself into one carefully, aware of the tear along the inner seam of his pants that he had stitched closed with black thread that did not quite match the grey fabric, and he folded his hands in his lap and waited, and tried to remember how to breathe like a man who belonged in a room like this. That was when the doors at the far end of the floor opened and Marcus Sterling walked in. Daniel did not know the name yet. Not in that first moment. He only knew the way the room seemed to shift, the way 3 other applicants sat up straighter, the way a young receptionist practically leapt from her chair. And he understood in the animal part of his brain that this was a man who was used to being feared. Marcus Sterling was maybe 35, with a haircut that looked like it cost more than Daniel made in a month, and a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed to have been poured onto him, and he walked through the waiting room with the easy, careless stride of a man who had never once in his life wondered if he would eat that night. He was reviewing a tablet as he walked, barely looking up, rattling off names. And when he reached Daniel's row, he stopped. He looked Daniel over slowly, from his damp, duct-taped shoes to his soft grey cuffs to the thin, ill-fitting jacket stretched across his shoulders, and something in his expression curdled, a thin, cold smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile Daniel had seen before, on landlords, on loan officers, on people who had decided who he was before he had said a single word. "Is this a joke?" Marcus Sterling said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Is someone playing a prank on my HR department? Because I did not know we were interviewing people off the street corner today." Daniel felt his face go hot, then cold, and he opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to say something, anything. But Marcus was already turning to the small crowd of stunned applicants, gesturing at Daniel with his tablet, like he was showing off an exhibit at a museum. "Look at this suit," he said. $20, maybe less. I could smell the thrift store on it from the elevator. And he laughed, a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it at all, and two of the other applicants laughed nervously along with him. Not because it was funny, but because fear has a way of making people echo whatever the powerful man in the room decides to feel. Daniel sat perfectly still. He had been humiliated before, he had been turned away from job after job. He had been looked at like a problem to be solved, rather than a man to be seen. But there was something about this moment, this particular cruelty, delivered in front of strangers, under bright lights, in a suit he had pressed at midnight with trembling hands, thinking of his daughter's cough, that cracked something open in his chest that he had been holding shut for a very long time. His eyes burned and he blinked hard, refusing, absolutely refusing, to let this man see him cry. "We do not hire charity cases here," Marcus Sterling continued, his voice carrying easily across the marble and glass. "This is Sterling Global Holdings, not a soup kitchen, and if you cannot afford a proper suit, sir, I have to wonder what exactly you think you have to offer this company." The room had gone completely silent, except for the trickle of the fountain somewhere behind the reception desk, and Daniel could feel every pair of eyes on him now. Could feel the heat crawling up the back of his neck and somewhere deep inside his chest, past the shame, past the humiliation. A small hard voice reminded him of Emma's cough, of the folded matchbook under the table leg, of the doctor's tired eyes saying the word surgery. He stood up slowly, gathering the last shreds of his dignity around himself like a coat too thin for the weather, and he opened his mouth to say something, though he did not yet know what, and that was the exact moment the elevator at the end of the hall chimed open. An older man stepped out, silver-haired, dressed simply, without the flash or polish of Marcus Sterling's tailored suit, and he paused in the doorway of the waiting room, his gaze sweeping across the scene before him, across Marcus Sterling's cold smile, across the frightened applicants, across Daniel standing there with his broken shoes and his trembling hands. And then his eyes found Daniel's face, and everything in the room seemed to stop. The old man's mouth opened slightly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked, impossibly, like recognition. And Marcus Sterling turned to see what had captured the room's attention, his smug expression faltering for just a moment. The silver-haired man took one step forward, his voice quiet but carrying through the sudden silence like a struck bell. "Daniel," he said, "is that really you?" The old man's voice hung in the air of the waiting room like something sacred, and for a long moment, Daniel could not speak at all, because the face in front of him, weathered now, lined with 5 more years of living, was a face he had carried in the back of his mind every single day since a rainy October night on the interstate, a face he had never expected to see again. "Arthur," he finally whispered, his voice cracking on the single syllable. Marcus Sterling's head snapped toward his grandfather, confusion flashing across his sharp features, and the smug smile that had been sitting so comfortably on his mouth just seconds before began to falter, the way ice begins to crack when the first real weight is set upon it. "You know this man," Marcus said, and it was not really a question, it was disbelief dressed up as one. Arthur Sterling did not answer him. Not yet. He was already crossing the marble floor in long, urgent strides, closing the distance between himself and Daniel with the desperate speed of a man who had waited years for a moment he had stopped believing would ever come. And when he reached him, he did not offer a handshake. He wrapped both arms around Daniel and held him the way a father holds a son returned from war. Daniel stood frozen for a heartbeat, unused to being touched with anything other than pity or indifference. And then something inside him broke quietly open, and he let himself be held, let himself feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like he was not invisible. 5 years, Arthur said, pulling back just enough to look at Daniel's face, his eyes wet and shining under the harsh fluorescent lights. 5 years I have looked for you. Do you have any idea? I hired investigators. I put up a reward. I went back to that stretch of highway a dozen times hoping someone would remember something, and you had just gone, like you had never existed at all. The room around them had gone utterly silent. Every applicant, every passing employee, every receptionist behind the marble desk frozen in place, watching a scene none of them understood. And Marcus stood at the edge of it all, his tablet hanging forgotten at his side, his face draining slowly of its earlier arrogance. I did not want to be found, Daniel said quietly. I just wanted to make sure you were alive. That was all that mattered to me that night. I had a wife at home, a newborn daughter. I could not stay and explain myself to reporters or police. I just needed to know you would live. Arthur's jaw tightened, and he turned then, slowly, to face his grandson, and the warmth that had filled his voice only seconds before drained away entirely, replaced by something colder, something Daniel had never seen, on the old man's face, even in the terror of that burning wreck 5 years ago. Marcus, Arthur said, his voice low and dangerously even, do you know what this man did? Marcus opened his mouth and closed it again, saying nothing, because whatever he had been about to say seemed to shrink under the weight of his grandfather's stare. 5 years ago, Arthur continued, turning back to address not just Marcus now, but the entire silent room. I was driving home from the Albany office late at night, in the rain, and a truck ran me off the road on Route 9. My car flipped 3 times before it came to rest against a guardrail, and it caught fire, and I was trapped, my leg pinned beneath the dashboard, and I remember thinking, quite calmly, that I was going to die there, alone in the rain with the smell of smoke filling the car. He paused, and Daniel felt his own chest tighten at the memory, at the smell of gasoline and burning rubber, at the sound of a stranger's screams cutting through the storm. And then, Arthur said, his voice thickening, a man appeared out of the darkness, a stranger, someone who had pulled over on the shoulder of a highway in the pouring rain. And he did not hesitate. He did not think about the flames. He broke the window with a tire iron, and he pulled me out with his bare hands, and I remember his palms were burned, badly, and he did not even seem to notice. He just kept telling me I was going to be all right, that I was going to be all right, until the ambulance came. Several of the applicants in the waiting room had begun to cry quietly, without meaning to, and the receptionist behind the desk pressed a hand to her mouth. That man saved my life, Arthur said, and he did not wait for a reward. He did not leave his name. He vanished into the night before I could even properly thank him. And I have spent 5 years wondering who he was, wondering if I would ever get the chance to look him in the eyes and say, thank you. And today, Marcus, today of all days, I walk into my own company's lobby to find you mocking that very man for the clothes on his back. Marcus's face had gone pale, his mouth working soundlessly, and Daniel watched something collapse behind the young CEO's eyes, some tower of arrogance he had built his entire identity upon, crumbling in real time. Grandfather, I did not know, Marcus stammered. I could not have known. That is precisely the problem, Arthur said, his voice rising now, filling the marble lobby. That is exactly the problem, Marcus. You did not know, and so you decided a man's worth based on the state of his shoes, based on the thread count of his suit. And let me tell you something about the man standing in front of you. This man had every reason in the world to keep driving that night. He had a wife waiting for him, a newborn baby. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose by stopping. And he stopped anyway because that is who he is. That is character. Marcus, that is the thing you cannot buy with a $5,000 suit. Daniel stood very still through all of it, his throat tight, his eyes burning, and he became aware distantly that his hands were trembling, Not from the cold this time, but from something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope, an emotion he had learned, painfully, over the last 3 years, not to trust. Arthur turned back to him then, and his expression softened again, the fury draining out of his face, and leaving behind something gentler, something almost pleading. "Tell me what happened to you," Arthur said. "Tell me everything, because a man like you does not end up standing in a thrift store suit in my lobby by accident. Something happened, and I want to know what." And so, standing there in the middle of the marble lobby, with strangers watching, and Marcus Sterling frozen useless at the edges of the scene, Daniel told him. He told him about Rebecca, about the rain that had taken her, the way rain had once nearly taken Arthur, about the guilt that had eaten at him ever since, the guilt of having saved a stranger's life while being unable to save his own wife's, about the warehouse floors he mopped at midnight, about the newspapers he delivered before dawn, about the 6-year-old daughter waiting for him at home, with a cough that would not go away, and a doctor who kept using the word surgery like it was something small. Arthur listened to every word without interrupting, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, his eyes never once leaving Daniel's face. And when Daniel finally fell silent, the old man closed his eyes for a moment, as though absorbing a physical blow. "You have been carrying all of this alone," Arthur said quietly. "For 3 years. Alone." Daniel did not trust his voice enough to answer, so he only nodded. Arthur reached up and, without a word of explanation, unbuttoned his own charcoal wool overcoat, the kind that cost more than Daniel earned in a month, and draped it gently over Daniel's shoulders, the warmth of it settling over him like something out of a dream he had stopped allowing himself to have. "We are going to fix this," Arthur said. "All of it, starting today, starting right now." And he turned toward the reception desk, his voice suddenly crisp and commanding, in a way that made the young receptionist jump to attention. "Get me Dr. Whitfield at Memorial Children's on the phone immediately. Tell him Arthur Sterling's calling about a young patient named Emma, and I want the best cardiac team in this city looking at her file within the hour." Daniel's knees nearly buckled, and he reached out to steady himself against the back of a leather chair. Disbelief and gratitude, crashing over him in a wave so powerful, it stole the breath from his lungs. "You do not have to do this," Daniel managed to say. "You already saved my life once by letting me save yours. You owe me nothing, Arthur. Nothing at all." Arthur turned to him, and there were tears now, unashamed, tracking down the lines of his weathered face. "Owe you nothing," he repeated softly. "Daniel, I owe you everything. I owe you every sunrise I have seen in the last 5 years, every birthday, every holiday with my grandchildren, every single breath I have taken since that night on Route 9. You gave me all of that, and you did it asking for nothing in return. And now you are standing in my lobby in a coat that cannot keep out the cold, with a daughter who needs a surgeon, and you tell me I owe you nothing." He reached out and gripped Daniel's shoulders firmly, steadying him, grounding him, the way he had once been steadied and grounded on the side of a burning highway. "You are not applying for a job here today," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are coming home, Daniel. And Marcus," he added, turning his head just slightly toward his grandson, without releasing Daniel from his gaze. "You are going to learn, right now, exactly who this man is. Because before this day is finished, you are going to understand precisely why I am about to hand him something I have never handed anyone in 40 years of building this company." Marcus stood frozen, his face ashen, waiting, along with everyone else in that silent marble lobby, to hear what his grandfather would say next. Arthur Sterling turned slowly, deliberately, to face the wide, silent lobby, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer trembling with grief or gratitude. It had steadied into something else, entirely, something that sounded, to Daniel's ears, like the voice of a man who had spent 40 years building an empire, and now intended to use every ounce of that power for something that finally mattered. "Marcus," he said, effective this moment, "you are relieved of your position as Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Global Holdings." The words landed in the lobby like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of them moved across every face in the room, the stunned applicants, the wide-eyed receptionist, the security guard who had drifted closer without anyone noticing, and Marcus himself, who staggered half a step backward as though the old man had struck him. "Grandfather, please," Marcus said, his voice cracking now, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. Please, I made a mistake. One mistake. Do not do this in front of everyone. Do not humiliate me the way I humiliated him. Arthur turned to look at his grandson, and there was no cruelty in his expression, only a deep and exhausted sorrow. The look of a man who had hoped for better and been disappointed one too many times. I am not humiliating you, Arthur said quietly. I am teaching you. There is a difference, and if the lesson feels like humiliation, then perhaps you should sit with that feeling for a while, because that is precisely the feeling you left on this man's chest when you mocked his shoes in front of strangers. That is precisely the feeling you left on his heart when you called him a charity case, and you did it without knowing his name, without knowing his story, without knowing that the $20 suit on his back was the only thing standing between his daughter and a hospital bill he could not pay. Marcus's eyes filled, and for the first time since Daniel had laid eyes on him, the young man looked genuinely, painfully human, stripped of his tailored armour, stripped of his easy cruelty, just a grandson standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, some old familiar instinct toward mercy that had never quite left him no matter how much the world had taken from him, and he stepped forward, gently, placing a hand on Arthur's arm. Arthur, he said softly, do not take his company from him because of me. I did not come here for revenge. I came here because I needed a job, that is all. I do not want anyone's downfall on my conscience, not even his. Arthur looked at him for a long moment, and something like wonder passed across his weathered face. The wonder of a man witnessing, for the second time in his life, the sheer scale of this stranger's goodness. You see, Arthur said, turning back to Marcus, this is exactly what I mean. This man has every right to want you gone, every right to watch you lose everything, the way you tried to make him feel like nothing, and instead he is standing here defending you. Do you understand now, Marcus? Do you finally understand what real strength looks like? It does not look like a $5,000 suit and a sharp tongue. It looks like a man in broken shoes choosing kindness when cruelty was handed to him on a silver platter. Marcus lowered his head, and his shoulders began to shake quietly. And when he lifted his face again, his eyes were red and wet and finally honest. I am sorry, he said, turning to Daniel directly, the words rough and unpracticed in his mouth, as though he had rarely in his life had to say them, and mean them. I am sorry for what I said. I am sorry for how I looked at you. I judged you before I knew a single true thing about you, and I have no excuse for that, none at all. Daniel studied him for a moment, this young man who had built his entire identity on the armour of contempt, and he thought of Emma, of how he wanted her to grow up in a world where people were given the chance to become better than their worst moment, and he nodded slowly. I forgive you, Daniel said simply, and the words seemed to loosen something in Marcus's chest, his breath leaving him in a long, shuddering exhale. Arthur watched this exchange with quiet approval, and then he addressed the room once more, his voice returning to its earlier authority, though gentler now, tempered by everything that had just passed between them. Marcus will keep his position, Arthur said, but on one condition, that he spends the next 6 months working directly beside Daniel, learning what it actually means to build something, not just inherit it, learning to see people, all people, not just the ones in expensive suits. Marcus nodded quickly, gratefully, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, in a way that made him look, for just a moment, like the small boy Arthur had once carried on his shoulders through the halls of this very building. And Daniel, Arthur continued, turning back to him with a warmth that filled the whole lobby, you are not applying for an entry-level position. Anymore, effective today, you are the new head of financial strategy for Sterling Global Holdings, a position I am creating specifically because this company needs men like you at its centre, men who know what it costs to survive, men who understand that every number on a balance sheet represents a human life somewhere. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, to say it was too much, too sudden, that he had not earned it. But Arthur held up a hand, silencing him with the same gentleness he had used to silence Marcus. You earned this 5 years ago, Arthur said, on the side of a burning highway, with your hands burned and your voice steady, telling a dying stranger he was going to be all right. Everything since then has just been the world catching up to what you already proved that night. The receptionist chose that moment to step forward, phone in hand, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of what she had just witnessed. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "Dr. Whitfield is on the line. He says he can see Emma this afternoon. He is clearing his schedule personally." Daniel's legs finally gave out beneath him, not from weakness but from the sheer flood of relief crashing through his body all at once, and Arthur caught him before he fell, wrapping an arm around him and holding him upright the same way Daniel had once held him upright on the shoulder of Route 9. "She is going to be all right," Arthur murmured, echoing the very words Daniel had once given him in the rain. "She is going to be all right, Daniel. I promise you that. And this time someone else is standing beside you carrying the weight. You do not have to carry it alone anymore." Daniel wept then, openly, in the middle of that marble lobby. 5 years of grief and fear and exhaustion finally breaking free from the place he had locked it all away. And no one in that room looked away from him. No one saw a broken man in a cheap suit. They saw, finally, exactly who he had always been. 3 months later, Emma sat in a hospital garden, wrapped in a warm coat, her cheeks pink with colour that had not been there before, her surgery long behind her, and her small heart finally beating strong and steady. And she laughed as she chased a butterfly across the grass while Daniel watched from a bench nearby, dressed now in a suit that fit him perfectly, though he had insisted on keeping the old $20 jacket folded carefully in the back of his closet, a reminder of everything it had carried him through. Marcus visited them there that afternoon, no longer wearing the sharp, cold expression Daniel remembered from that first day, but something softer, something that had been earned through months of humbling work beside a man he had once dismissed at a glance, and he crouched down to Emma's level, offering her a small stuffed bear he had brought, and she took it with the easy trust of a child who had learned that kindness, once you let it in, tends to multiply. Arthur joined them a few minutes later, moving slower now than he once had, leaning on a cane he had needed ever since that night on the highway. But his eyes were bright, and he settled onto the bench beside Daniel, watching Emma play in the afternoon sun. "Do you ever wonder," Arthur said quietly, "what would have happened if you had just kept driving that night? If you had told yourself it was not your problem, that you had a family waiting, that the rain was too heavy and the road too dangerous to stop?" Daniel watched his daughter twirl in the grass, her laughter carrying across the garden like something bright and unbreakable. And he thought about the answer for a long moment before he spoke. "I think," Daniel said slowly, "that the world does not need more people who wait for the perfect moment to be kind. It needs people who choose kindness, even when it costs them something, especially when it costs them something, because that is the only kind of kindness that actually means anything." Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes glistening again, and he reached over and gripped Daniel's shoulder the way a father grips the shoulder of a son he is proud of. "You saved my life on that highway," Arthur said softly, "but I think, in a much quieter way, you have been saving mine, and Marcus's every single day since, just by being exactly who you are." The wind moved gently through the garden, nothing like the cutting cold of that winter morning outside the glass tower, and Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun settle over him, letting himself finally believe that the years of struggle had not been wasted, that somewhere in the broken shoes and the duct tape and the freezing walk to a job interview that had nearly destroyed him, there had been a thread of purpose all along, quietly waiting to be pulled into the light, because in the end, it was never the suit that made the man, it was the choice he made when no one was watching, the hand he offered when he had nothing left to give, and the quiet, unshakable belief that even in his darkest, coldest hour, kindness was still worth choosing. And somewhere in that hospital garden, beneath a sky finally clear of storms, a little girl's laughter proved, more than any words ever could, that it always would be.